Semi-arid areas are difficult to restore, and to help overcome the challenges, we need good metrics for restoration success, particularly for seeding of desirable perennials. And I'm going to focus on what can be learned from an intensely treated and monitored area that occurred along the Idaho-Oregon border in the western United States. This was the 2015 Soda megafire area. This occurred in sagebrush steppe, which is normally occupied by semi-evergreen shrubs, most notably sagebrush, as well as bunch grasses, forbs, bare soil, and biological crusts. Annual grasses such as cheatgrass are invading these areas, increasing wildfire fuels, and they do well after fires, creating more additional fire and ultimately causing these perennial communities to be converted into annual grasslands, and that's a huge problem for land management. So I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors and many BLM people who worked with us on this project. This is a genuinely co-produced effort. So the Soda wildfire occurred after a fairly major monumental paradigm shift in the way the Department of Interior and its partners do business regarding fire in sagebrush steppe. So sagebrush is not adapted to large megafires that occur frequently, and there's some species, wildlife species like greater sage-grouse that are dependent on sagebrush who become imperiled due to the fire. In 2015, the Department of Interior had to consider the greater sage-grouse for listing under the Endangered Species Act. The decision was not to list it, in part because the Bureau of Land Management and other partners had agreed to change the way that the land was managed, particularly after fire, using restoration to deal with the problems. And the Secretary of the Department of Interior issued a secretarial order to this effect. And soon after that order, the first major wildfire was this Soda burned area. Here you can see it surrounded by the red boundary. And it's right next to Boise, Idaho, an area that has almost 1 million people. So about 300,000 acres were burned that were very heterogeneous. There was canyons, plateaus, low elevation areas where sagebrush met its warm, dry limits, areas that still have snow on them as I speak at high elevations, and also a very rich land use history. Most notably livestock raising. So on this elevation map here, you can see over 100 different polygons showing different livestock raising units. There was a lot happening on this landscape, and in order to adequately sample it to provide more objective data than has been acquired before for burned areas, everyone was interested in having quantitative defensible data. So each one of these points shows an observation plot that was measured for each of the 5 years after the wildfire. This is a 5-year project, and I'm very pleased to say that we were successful in collectively working with the BLM, pulling through to the finish line for it. That in itself is a major accomplishment, and I hope buys some credibility moving forward for the BLM in these collaborative efforts. There was a lot of treatments that happened on the burned area. Herbicide spraying of imazapic, that's a pre-emergent herbicide designed to knock out annual grasses without much impact to perennials. We're still learning about its effectiveness, but here you can see large polygons sprayed in the first or second year that were superimposed onto areas where grasses, bunch grasses, were drill seeded. These bunch grasses provide competition against exotic annuals. And on top of that, there were 180,000 acres that were aerial seeded with sagebrush and different forbs at various times since the fire. So here you can see the complex layering of different treatments over time. Aerial grass seedings in the hilly areas where drill seeding could not occur. So heavily treated. How do we pull all this off? Well, there was naysayers. People thought that the sampling of this extent was simply not possible, and that we could rely on the expert opinion and drive-by observations that have traditionally been used by many fire managers for these large rangeland landscapes. We were able to make some very careful, innovative use of digital systems for our data collection, which were greatly so valuable for allowing us to pull this off. I'm very pleased to say that we were successful, and in fact, we were able to get the costs of this sampling in a very favorable way compared to what most routine monitoring costs by just about any agency working in similar habitats. So feasibility is there, and the costs can be done correctly, especially when you consider the costs of the treatments themselves. So why do we monitor? Well, here you can see a field technician holding a camera on a pole cam, taking a photograph of the ground area. That photograph will then later be evaluated in the lab to determine percent cover by species. So a species list is collected along with us. So why were we doing this kind of work? Well, first thing was to inform the BLM of the retreatment needs and opportunities that existed on the landscape. In other words, adaptive management. In order to do this, we had to come up with special agreements in order to roll out provisional preliminary data that had been quality control, quality assured, corrected, but to do it in a rapid way. We used Survey 123 and Mesa 2 laptops in the field and different geodatabase and access databases to make this all happen. We were one of the first users of Survey 123, by the way. Second, the funders of this project needed to have data rolled up to them for accountability. And then thirdly, perhaps most importantly, the BLM land managers and the grazing permittees needed information on whether or not the vegetation recovery was meeting objectives. That was used as the decision point for allowing livestock back onto the landscape. So fairly contentious. The data needed to be durable if litigation were to occur or scrutiny. And that was actually pretty healthy for us. It led to a very durable, strong system of accountability. And one thing that we all appreciate, there's a lot of humility in this process. There's plenty of R&D that happened. We all embrace the idea that there's variability on the landscape, and that variability is something that we oftentimes try to suppress. In our case, we embraced it. All of our data were communicated with a measure of variability about the mean. And that is perhaps a hallmark of our data collections. So in addition to those aerial photos, which by the way were captured at the center of the plot and then away over here, 2 by 3 meter square areas, we measured the density of key species like sagebrush or noxious weeds or desirable high-value forbs. To do this, we use a nested frequency approach. It's very rapid and effective. All of these species can come up in very patchy, variable ways, and sometimes you need to search a large area in order to know if they are within the vicinity. Having one sagebrush plant within a large plot is something we want to know, because that sagebrush could grow and become reproductive in the future and give rise to a small population eventually. So we would sample, count the number of plants so long as we found at least 3 sagebrush or forbs in these inner 1 meter squared areas, or 6 meters squared, or 13 meters squared, or all the way out to 1,000 meters squared, sampling the smallest area possible. All told, the sampling area was about 2 million meters squared for this. For perennial bunch grasses, we would measure their cover as well, using the aerial photos, but also the size and the density of them, the size with basal diameter, just looking at the collar of the plant, the shoot-stem interface, shoot-root interface. We also monitor roots. Roots and bunch grass sizes are really, really critical for understanding the resistance of these plant community to invasion by exotic annual grasses, and the resilience of these plant communities to any future fires that might roll through. And certainly they will reburn at some point in time. We want to know that the investment made in this landscape will not need to be repeated in the future, that we can improve the resistance and resilience to create a less needy landscape. Well, how much cover, what kind of density of plants, and what size plants do you need in order to get resistance and resilience? Well, it's hard to know from the literature. Our data set, I think, will be valuable in allowing us to refine these threshold values. These were the standards that the mean and standard error of the vegetation recovery were held against. For shrubs, this is interesting. Density needed to be 1 plant per 10 meters squared. That's based on wildlife needs in suitable areas. What is a suitable area? Well, we didn't really know at the time. We knew that there'd be patchy recovery, and so we didn't want to treat these areas as if they were farm fields and use metrics that are devised for homogeneous areas. Well, it turned out there was a little bit of circularity in the assessment plan, which is okay. We also did things like measured wildlife responses by recording the presence of scat. Yellow shows where scat was present of the sage grouse, able to now know how the treatments affected this wildlife species. I don't have the time to talk about that, but we could get into it later. Most importantly, we had ended up oversampling some areas. So our sampling was 1 plot per 135 acres or better. And in some areas, like flat areas, that turned out to be more sampling than necessary. We were able to take the data, once collected, put it in a spreadsheet, and run some Monte Carlo simulations withdrawing certain numbers of plots. Each one of these is a plot, and we could calculate the standard error and see how many samples is needed to get you into a desirable standard error. 20% of relative standard error is about a 95% confidence interval in this case. So that would be our threshold sampling requirement for a scientist perspective. For a manager, they were happy with 80% confidence interval. We can then take that threshold sampling needed and plot it for each of these pastures. Okay, so each one of these might have 20 or 40 or 50 plots in it, and plot it against the elevation or the dominance of exotic annual grasses or perennial grasses to see how landscape and biotic factors might affect the minimum sample size needed. Now, this kind of analysis is really valuable for knowing whether or not the data collected already are a reliable measure of recovery. And that could be useful, for example, if there's litigation over grazing, post-fire grazing on a seeded area. It can also be useful for planning future budget needs or people's time and effort for sampling burned areas. How many plots will you do? This kind of information I think is really valuable. With this intensive sampling, we learned a lot about the patchiness in sagebrush recovery. Here's a map of that. Dark areas in Oregon and these low elevations show where there was very few, where actually there was no seeding. So seeding had a huge effect on sagebrush recovery, much more than was previously reported. Perhaps that was due to our better sampling, better detection. But many other sources of variability here, including like soil factors. So for sagebrush outplants, we found that soil type was a really strong predictor of where the survival was better or worse for sagebrush outplants. We were then able to make decision trees to help figure out, like, well, what are those hotspots for recovery? And in those areas where we expect to see recovery, we might have a different metric for success compared to areas like low elevations where the success wasn't expected to be as good. So that's the kind of information that I think is really useful for tuning our expectations and metrics. So just to recap, we use the SMART criteria: specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound objectives and methods. Is our method best? And that was a recipe for success. What type of monitoring is best? Is ours best for everywhere? Absolutely not. Ours was tuned to rapid sampling of many plots across a huge burned area. That contrasts the BLM AIM style monitoring that is more suited to detecting trends across a few areas. We proved that high throughput sampling is feasible in these types of areas, And when you do that, you can then get a handle on variability, which again is crucial. These are patchy landscapes. That needs to be embraced in the metrics, in our opinion. Again, I already mentioned tuning the project objectives to expectations, suitable microsites. And then finally, the success of our project, I think, undoubtedly lied in the fact that the BLM was willing and interested and capable of delegating and funding a third party to come in and do the monitoring. We were dedicated. We were able to work and focus with the BLM for 5 years to pull through on this and provide a rare example of monitoring that is just a gold mine of information for restoration in these dry areas needing human intervention. Thank you.